Today's lesson is Braille, a revolutionary system for reading and writing. Hi, everybody. My name is Roger.
And my name is Helen.
And today we're going to talk about something called Braille, which, as the title says, is a system for reading and writing for blind people. They use their fingers to touch dots on a piece of paper, and therefore they are able to read. And we're describing this as being revolutionary, which means it has made a big change in things.
Yes, sometimes you come across Braille writing in elevators underneath the numbers, the buttons that you press to get from floor to floor. And once I tried reading Braille, I closed my eyes and touched the little dots, and it was almost impossible for me to tell the difference because I wasn't used to it, I guess. But if you do put the effort into learning how to read and write Braille, whether or not you can see, I'm sure it's something that can be done.
It certainly can. So again, today's topic is Braille, and of course, Braille can be written in many languages, and I'm sure blind people here in Taiwan benefit from using Braille as well. So let's jump into our article now. Let's read the first part, and then we'll come back to discuss it.
Braille, a revolutionary system for reading and writing. Braille has been revolutionary for people with blindness. A system of raised dots on paper, Braille is not itself a language, but rather a code that enables millions of blind people to read and write in many different languages. Read on to discover the history of this incredible invention.
So the title of today's article is Braille, a revolutionary system for reading and writing. And we're calling this system revolutionary because it has completely changed the way that blind people can read and write, allowing them to read and write. So something that is revolutionary is completely different from what came before. It is able to change the way people do things or the way that people think. So, for instance, when the telephone was invented over 100 years ago, it was considered a revolutionary invention because before then, it was impossible for people who were separated by long distances to hear each other's voices.
Of course, revolution, refers to a big change in society when a government is toppled and another government takes its place. We could talk about the French Revolution, the American Revolution, etc. But here, revolutionary is an adjective, and this system is revolutionary, or at least it was at the time it came out. It allowed blind people to finally be able to read things. Now, here in the first paragraph, it says, Braille has been revolutionary for people with blindness. Blindness is the state of being blind, and of course, Braille has been revolutionary for those people. It allows them to read using their fingers, a system of raised dots on paper. Braille is not itself a language, but rather a code that enables millions of blind people to read and write in many different languages. So this sentence here basically tells us what Braille is. It's a system of raised dots on paper. I guess it could also be on metal in elevators or in other places, but for the most part, these dots are raised so you can feel them with your fingers, and it's a system of raised dots. They have different sequences of those raised dots to represent different letters and symbols and stuff like that.
Yes, and it's also interesting to note that Braille itself isn't a language, in case some people thought that it was one language that people who spoke different languages could communicate in through reading and writing. But in fact, it's a system of lettering, let's say, using raised dots that can be used to read and write in different languages.
And here's the next sentence that ends the first part of our lesson. It says, read on to discover the history of this incredible invention. So continue reading. We've got more information in our article. And as is the case with our program here, we want you to listen on, continue listening, and you'll learn more about the history of this invention that is indeed incredible. So let's do it. Let's move on now to the second part. We'll listen to it first.
The story of Braille begins with Charles Barbier, who believed that conventional writing was at times a barrier to literacy. In 1815, he proposed an alternative writing system based on the Polybius square. The system was composed of cells with 2 columns, each with 6 dots arranged vertically. The dots could be raised to indicate a phonetic sound on a corresponding 6x5 grid. For example, a cell with 4 raised dots in the first column and 3 in the second represented the sound in the 4th row and 3rd column of the grid.
大家好，第二部分我们看到形容词 conventional， 指传统的、通常的或是惯例的。例如 Though the car runs on electricity, it has a very conventional body design. 虽然那辆车是电动的，它的车身设计倒是很传统。或是 A combination of therapy and drugs is the most conventional way to treat depression. 心理治疗与药物并用是治疗忧郁症最常见的做法。另外将这个字字尾的 al 去掉，就变成了名词 convention， 表示常规或是惯例。像是 Bernice acts as she pleases with little concern for convention. Bernice 随心所欲，不太在意世俗常规。也可以说 When you travel internationally, be aware that social conventions may vary greatly from country to country. 当你在国际旅行时，要注意社交惯例在各个国家间可能会有很大的差异。再补充 conventional 的同义词 customary, C-U-S-T-O-M-A-R-Y, customary, 意思是习俗的或是惯常的。我们可以说It is customary to celebrate Easter in the U.S. with an Easter egg hunt. 在美国，用寻找复活节彩蛋来庆祝复活节是习俗。或者 It is customary to visit relatives at Christmas in the United States. 在美国，在圣诞节拜访亲戚很正常。接下来我们看到副词 vertically， 表示垂直的或是直立的。举例来说 Be careful if you want to pile the boxes vertically. 如果你要把箱子垂直堆起来的话，小心一点。或是 The seagull dove vertically into the ocean and returned with a fish. 海鸥垂直冲向海洋，并抓了一只鱼回来。另外，介绍这个字的形容词 vertical, V-E-R-T-I-C-A-L, vertical, 指垂直的或是直立的。像是At the edge of the road was a several 100-foot vertical drop. 在这条路的边缘有到数百英尺的垂直落差。也可以说 The bus did not have enough vertical clearance to go through the tunnel. 巴士没有足够的垂直空间穿越隧道。再来我们看到形容词 corresponding, 指相应的。例如 As you can see from the figures in corresponding graph, sales have increased. 你可以看到数值和其对应图表，销售额已经升高了。或是 The test asked students to match the images with the corresponding text. 这个测验要求学生将图片和与其相对应的文字配对在一起。另外将这个字字尾的 ing 去掉，就变成了动词 correspond, 指符合或是相对应。像是 The clothes I ordered did not correspond to the images on the website. 我订购的衣服和我在网站上看到的图片不一样。也可以说 Each of these numbers corresponds to a student on this list. 这里的每个数字都对应着一位这个名单上的学生。
So now let's look at the history of Braille. It says here, the story of Braille begins with Charles Barbier, who believed that conventional writing was at times a barrier to literacy. So the invention of this system of reading and writing, known as Braille, begins with a person named Charles Barbier, a Frenchman, and he believed that conventional writing, which is traditional writing or writing that is used by most people, this type of writing was at times a barrier to literacy. So here the phrase at times simply means sometimes. So it wasn't a barrier to literacy all the time, but at times, sometimes it can be. So if I were to use at times in another sentence, I could say, my friend calls me sometimes when she is feeling sad.
Okay, so again, we're talking about Braille here being something that will change conventional writing, because conventional writing was at times or sometimes from time to time a barrier to literacy. So a barrier, of course, is something that blocks or impedes something. And indeed, conventional writing is taking a pen or a pencil and writing symbols on a piece of paper. And if you're blind, of course, you can't see that. And if you use your fingers and touch that writing, you won't feel anything. And therefore, you probably won't be able to figure out how to read what is there, and you won't be able to understand it. So that indeed is a barrier sometimes to literacy, and literacy, of course, means being able to read. Now, in 1815, he proposed an alternative writing system based on the Polybius square. This is an alternative, which means another choice.
That's right. Now, just another note on the word barrier. We often hear the phrase language barrier. When you have a language barrier, it means that your inability to understand and speak a particular language is preventing you from being able to do something. So having a language barrier could prevent you from making friends, for instance, if you're in a new country where you don't speak that local language.
And the system was composed of cells with 2 columns, each with 6 dots arranged vertically. Okay, so it was composed of, it had these elements as part of the whole, to be composed of something. And in this case, the Polybius square includes those things, 2 columns and cells and 6 dots arranged vertically, which means up and down.
Right. So the phrase composed of or to be composed of is quite useful. You can use it in different contexts. You could say, for instance, that an apartment is composed of 2 bedrooms, 1 living room, and 1 kitchen and 1 bathroom, which means that this apartment is made up of or is formed by these separate rooms.
And the dots could be raised to indicate a phonetic sound on a corresponding 6x5 grid. Okay, so if you're talking about sounds in language, you're talking about phonetics. Here, phonetic is an adjective. It would indicate a phonetic sound. It could be b, p, m, f, etc. Those are phonetic sounds.
Right, so these dots can be raised to indicate a phonetic sound on a corresponding 6x5 grid. So here the word corresponding means related to or connected with something else. So these raised dots are connected to or related to a 6x5 grid. Now, a grid is a pattern of straight lines that cross each other to form tiny squares. So if you want to picture a grid in your mind, you might think of a chessboard. A chessboard is composed of grids where you put your chess pieces.
And a grid usually involves lines that go up and lines that go left and right. Okay, a grid, that would just be like a city or a bunch of streets in a city. If you look at them from above, you can see a grid down there, lines going up and down and left and right. That would be a grid. So you've got a 6x5 grid with those dots, and the dots correspond to the phonetic sounds. They represent them, or they are equal to those phonetic sounds. For example, let's give you an example here. This is a kind of a difficult concept to explain, but for example, a cell with 4 raised dots in the first column and 3 in the second represented the sound in the 4th row and 3rd column of the grid. So they correspond to each other. That's an example here.
Yes, and of course, this would be much easier to understand if there were visuals, if there was a diagram or a picture of this example.
That brings us to the end of the second part of our lesson for today. Let's move on to the third part, and we'll listen to it first.
In 1821, Barbier wrote to the Royal Institute for Blind Youth, an establishment in Paris, to tell the director about his invention. At that time, students at the institute read by feeling raised type, a method developed by the school's founder, Valentin Hoy. Reading raised type was difficult, and students could not produce their own writing using Hoy's method. Barbier's system represented an enormous leap forward in the students' education.
最后第三部分，我们看到单字 institute， 这个字是名词，指学院、机构或是协会。像是 Jeremy works at an art institute where he teaches painting. Jeremy 在一间艺术学院工作，他在那里教绘画。或是 An institute was formed to study the effects of pollution on the environment. 这间机构被建立以研究环境污染的影响。
So in the previous part, we were looking at Braille or the beginnings or Braille 1.0 and how they were made of dots that corresponded to a grid. Now, in 1821, Barbier wrote to the Royal Institute for Blind Youth, an establishment in Paris, to tell the director about his invention. So Barbier was probably quite happy with the invention, so he contacted the director of the Royal Institute for Blind Youth. So the institute here refers to an organization that does a particular type of work in education. In this case, it's an organization that is in charge of educating young people who cannot see, or blind youth. And this establishment was located in Paris. So here the word establishment is another word for organization. An institute is an organization that is there to teach people something. An establishment is a more general word for organization. It can be a business, it can be an institute, it can also be, let's say, a restaurant, an eating establishment.
Indeed. So, for example, I could say many business establishments are located on the avenue. And this, however, is an organization, an establishment in Paris, France, of course. And he wanted to tell the director about his invention. And at that time, students at the institute read by feeling raised type, a method developed by the school's founder, Valentin Hoy. So at the time, students were trying to read by touching letters. I guess in this particular case, they were letters that were raised. A type, of course, refers to something that is typed or written on a piece of paper. But in this particular case, it was raised type. So I guess you have the letters like A, B, C raised from the paper. So if you feel it, you can feel, oh, okay, that feels like an A. Okay, that feels like a B, because they're raised. They're higher than the paper.
Yep. Sometimes you can feel raised type in business cards. Fancy business cards sometimes have raised type. But I can imagine that raised type, when we're dealing with the regular alphabet, could be quite difficult to read or to understand. But in any case, this method of reading raised type was developed by the Royal Institute for Blind Youth's founder, Valentin Hoy.
And reading raised type was difficult, and students could not produce their own writing using Hoy's method. Okay, so indeed, I can imagine trying to touch different letters and trying to understand them would be difficult. And the students found this system difficult. I guess it's better than nothing, but of course we want to try to improve on that invention. And then another problem was that they couldn't produce their own writing using that method. How can you make raised letters yourself? Could you use special tools to punch the backside of the paper to make the letters rise up? It's kind of difficult to imagine that.
Yes, so Barbier's system represented an enormous leap forward in the students' education. So given that those students didn't have any other method for reading and writing other than what Valentin Hoy came up with, even though that was pretty helpful, Barbier's system was even more helpful. It represented an enormous leap. So that's another way of saying that it was revolutionary, and it really advanced the students' education.
Indeed. So that is talking about the beginning of Braille, going way back to the 19th century in France, in the early 19th century there. So we have those people to thank for the existence of Braille, and the rest is history. Now Braille is everywhere for blind people. Okay, that brings us to the end of our discussion for today. Let's listen now to Hanny, our beloved Chinese teacher.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。首先我们看到标题里面它用到 revolutionary 这个形容词，它是形容革命性的或是完全创新的。那它的名词是 revolution， 而 revolution 又是源自于动词 revolve， R-E-V-O-L-V-E。 那我们这边就来介绍它的字首字根。好， V-O-L-V-E Volve 这个字根它表示 roll， 就是有那种转动滚动的意思。在 revolve 这个字当中，它的字首 re 就是有 back 或是 again 的意思，返回再度。那么 volve 表示转动，合在一起呢 revolve 它就有旋